I spent my whole damn life in the city. I could go for broke, but the capital is in me. I spent my whole damn life in the city. Anywhere I go, DC's coming with me. I spent my whole damn life in the city. I could go for broke, but the capital is in me. I spent my whole damn life in the city. Anywhere I go, DC's coming with me. I spent my whole damn life in the city. I could go for broke, but the capital is in me.
Welcome, everyone, to District Divided, a DC sports podcast. More specifically, a Washington Commanders podcast. I am Amit, that is Kada, and we have a very special guest, Benjamin Robinson, author of grindingthemocks.com, where he basically aggregates all this mock draft data that keeps happening throughout the year and then comes up with the goods at the very end, letting you know around what pick people are going to go, sometimes absolutely nailing it. Ben, how are you doing today?
You know, we're 1 week out, and I feel like it's not as crazy as it was last year when I was getting, the accuracy in my data from the week before the draft last year was actually at its peak. And then in between the week before the draft and the actual draft, everything got worse. So this year feels more normal. We'll see.
So we're doing this at the right time. I'm glad to know that we're doing this at the right time. So we got some questions prepared for Ben. And before we begin it, if you could please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, comment as you always do. We're going to do the comment mailbag with our next episode, which is going to be a mock draft episode that comes out on Monday. And K-Dot?
Click the link in the description to make sure that you're following everything that Grind the Mocks does, and then share this shit.
Absolutely perfectly done, my friend. Without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get into it? So, like I had said, Ben has done this for quite some time. How many years now, Ben?
Since 2019. So if my math is right, that's 6 drafts.
Yeah, there we go. So since 2019, been doing this for quite some time. We're talking thousands of mock drafts. Is that correct?
Yeah, this year so far have about 1,500.
Okay. So 1,500 mock drafts, and he's figuring out, okay, based on all of this, where are people going? So you even put out your own mock draft. I'm assuming you're going to do it again this year. How many in the last couple seasons, how many of those first rounders have you gotten right? Like, not necessarily matched up with the correct team, but because that's crazy with all the trades. Yeah. But how many first rounders are you getting correct typically? So
I will say this, that my mock draft, the last couple of years, I've been writing for Football Outsiders. Football Outsiders is no more, unfortunately. So I haven't put out a mock draft, like I haven't written one this year. My rankings are way better at getting the first round correct. I get about like 85% of draft picks in the first round correct. So that's like out of the 32, you'd say between like 27 and 28, which is very good. And so over the last like 3 years. So in 2021, I got 26. In 2022, I had 30, which was really good. And then last year I had 26 again. But yeah, it's always around like 26, 27 usually. And in the 22 draft, it's kind of a funny one. It's like one of those, whenever anyone says that this draft is more unpredictable than it ever has been, that's usually when I do the best, because people just tend to rate how easy it is to predict this stuff at a high level if you're using data. Yeah.
I also wanted to shout you out for that draft because Peter Schrager at NFL Network was parading his 30 out of 32. And I was like, well, actually, Benjamin Robinson was on and literally did the same thing. And not enough people know about it. So glad. What I wanted to sort of highlight there is that you generally have a good sense of the board after the first round then. So you have a good sense of who the players are that are going to be available, and the Commanders have a couple early second round picks. So what, for that second round, amongst the remaining available players based on your data, what positions represent sort of the highest value at that point? Maybe the positions that have not been touched in the first round that much.
So yeah, the big kind of high level narrative around this draft is that the strongest position in the class is wide receiver. And so wide receiver is by far the position with the biggest supply of talent left after round 1. And so if you go to grindingthemocks.com and you go to our expected draft position board tab, there's a tab that you can click on that says horizontal board, and just gives you like a very quick look at the stacking within the position groups of players in each position. And you can just see that there's, a real dearth of players, like a real surplus of players in the wide receiver position. I know that, the Commanders lost Curtis Samuel to free agency this offseason. I know that they've, haven't gotten all the production they want out of anyone whose name is not Terry McLaurin. And so, whether that's like Jahan Dotson, who they used a first round pick on a couple years ago, the wide receiver position, I don't know if I see that being a huge need or something that they'll focus on, but it definitely, I think, is where the supply of players is the strongest outside of round one. And then after that, you can kind of look at some positions of need that the Commanders do have along the offensive and defensive lines, specifically at edge, specifically at tackle. Those are the kind of areas in the class. If you had to ask people what the strengths of the position groups are in this class, wide receiver, both at the top and in the depth of the position group, is really strong. And offensive tackle as well. I think you'll see, like offensive line, that there's some really good quality players that'll be available at the end of the first after the Commanders have taken their choice of quarterback. That's not Caleb Williams.
Okay, cool. Appreciate that. Kate, out over to you.
No, I'm just glad that you're not you're not also like giving us some Caleb Williams nonsense or anything. It's welcome to have civil, sane conversations around the draft because I'm losing my fucking mind.
It's over. I mean, I have a predictive model it's a private model that I use when I consult with teams. And, just today, my model has kind of said to me that it's 100% chance that Caleb is going to the Bears at number one. But yeah, like to me, like there's a 0% chance unless something, I don't know what would have to come out in order to change that. But yeah, he's going at number one and the Bears aren't shading out of it. So we can move on. And any of the other quarterbacks, they all have their warts. They all have their stars. And, I think choose among any one of them and you'll probably be fine unless that is Bo Nix or Michael Penix. And so that's my hot take. Don't take a quarterback at 2 that's going to go in the second round.
All right, wonderful. So if we're getting more specific into the Commanders and those second round draft picks, like at 36, at 40, where do you see us going if we keep both those picks, no trade outs or anything? Please don't you dare say Bo Nix and Michael Penix. We're picking a quarterback too. Okay. Are there names that we should be looking out for specifically right here in this particular area?
Yeah, I mean definitely not quarterback though. I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of pulled like a similar kind of tactic to what the Commanders did when they drafted RG3 and they also drafted Kirk Cousins just to get extra bodies at the position, but that's not, I wouldn't think that would happen until much later, kind of like, but in terms of that second round, the top positions mocked to the Commanders in the second round, my data are offensive tackle, edge rusher, and cornerback. And so to me, like I would expect, like I said, the outside of the wide receiver position, those, offensive line and defensive line are the strongest ones in terms of the ones that I would expect to have availability at the top of the second round. And I think it's really good that the Commanders have all these picks because, that's one of the big problems that other teams that are in a similar position to them in terms of needing a quarterback, they kind of sometimes will have to maybe force a pick. Yeah. And so for the Commanders, having these like dearth of draft, having all these draft picks like really gives them a lot of opportunity to hit at different areas. So yeah, so to me, offensive tackle, edge rusher, cornerback, when I look at the offensive tackles, the two guys that really, really come to mind as good options are Jordan Morgan from Arizona and one of my favorite names in the draft, Kingsley Suamataia from Brigham Young. So both those guys are kind of mocked at the end of the first round, but I could also see them potentially getting into that second round conversation that I think are really strong. I think Jordan Morgan and Suamataia are both like 49ers types guys. And so, with Adam Peters coming over from the 49ers, I could see him taking a shot at a developmental lineman like Suamataia and a versatile, experienced player like Morgan who could play guard and play tackle. And then at edge, I see a couple of guys who I think could be interesting. One is Marshawn Kneeland, who's an edge rusher from Western Michigan, who's one of the biggest risers in the last month of data. There's been a lot of buzz around him as a potential first rounder. I still think that right now, if I had to guess, I would say that he ends up more somewhere in the second round. And I think that he would be someone who the Commanders and who Dan Quinn would really like his skill set, just like let him go. And then the other guy is Chris Braswell, who I'm less jazzed about, but he's an edge from Alabama. We know that Washington does have a lot of history with Bama players. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to stick now, but they love going into the well at Bama to get all kinds of guys on both sides of the ball. And then the last position group there, I'd say, is cornerback. And I know that Emmanuel Forbes was the first round pick last year. You know, he played about 50% of the defensive snaps last year, which is a good start, better than a bunch of other players that you might have seen in the class. But, you know, you see other, you know, cornerbacks that they've, you know, tried at the Benjamin St. Juste of the world that really haven't really done as much as you would like. And so it's really good in the cornerback position to have bodies. And so a couple of bodies that I think are really interesting for the Commanders here are Ennis Rakestraw from Missouri and Kamari Lassiter from Georgia. So both from SEC teams that had really strong defenses, both Mizzou and Georgia, really strong defenses in the both on the line and in the back end. So you kind of know that they have a lot of solid prospects across the entire group. So to me, like offensive tackle, edge, cornerback, I think those are the positions that I would expect them to hit on at least, if not there in the second round, that they will still be available to look at later on, even in the third round on day 2.
Okay, cool. And I also has to be noted, and I think someone looked at this on X or Twitter, you know, whatever it was the other day, which is that they were looking at the 49ers top 30 visits from the past couple of years and noticing that half of their draft picks, or about maybe even a little under half, but under half to half of their draft picks were people that were on those top 30 visits. So a couple of the names that Ben had mentioned, just for context there, Jordan Morgan, the offensive tackle from Arizona, maybe he plays some guard, but has played tackle. He has a top 30 visit over here. And then same thing with Marshawn Kneeland. And in fact, Ben and I were bantering about this a bit earlier, where Marshawn Kneeland right now, his expected draft position is exactly 40, right? So, and we have pick 40. So that could just be something where we're at pick 40. He happens to be there. And based on mock draft data, you go, hey, this is the time to get him because he probably isn't there at 67 is sort of the way I would think about that. Talking about round 3 then, right? So we've talked about the offensive line. We've talked about the edge rushers, the corners, and we only have 2 picks in the second round. So maybe we address 2 of those 3 positions if we're going by need. What about the third round where we have picks 67, 78, and 100, 3 third round picks there, Ben?
Yeah, to me, I think at edge and cornerback, I think that's a position that you could still target there because you just need bodies, need more guys, need more players, because those have been areas where the team has kind of fallen short.
No,
so
these bodies still have talent, right?
Yeah, some of them, yeah, for sure. But I think
we've run into problems with that in the past.
Yeah, this is because I wanted to mention. I was like, all right, bodies, okay.
But yeah, to me, the premium positions, like, you know, for me, like the edge position, like, you know, the Commanders have, you know, lately been, you know, a lot of investment in interior. And then, you know, you had Chase Young, but, you know, Montez Sweat no longer with the org. And so to me, like, that's where I think you need more than just one guy. And so to me, edge and cornerback, it's good to have, you need rotation. And so to me, they may not focus it on it in the second round, but if they don't, that's a position where I could see, and the same thing with cornerback. But in terms of edges that I think are good, I think a good you know match, I'd have Braylon Trice from Washington, and one that I'm really intrigued by is Jonah Ellis from Utah, who I think would both be really good fits, just because, you know, Quinn, you know, in Dallas really had a strong bench. You know, he had Parsons, he had Demarcus Lawrence, but he also had guys behind him. They invested a lot in DL while he was there. Yeah. And in terms of other corners, I think Javon Bullard, also from Georgia, and then Cam Hart from Notre Dame, were 2 guys that I saw that could be third round options. Like I said, and corner is another position where you need to have, it's more important to have average to above average guys and have a lot of them than to have maybe just one star. But then at the tight end position is another area where I've seen mock drafts go.
Curious about this. Yeah, go ahead.
And there are 2 guys that I see in the third round that I think are really intriguing. And so one is Jatavian Sanders from Texas, who has kind of been following the entire process, and he didn't test super well athletically, but he has a lot of fans and he was a great recruit. So I think there's a lot of people in his corner. So I don't know. I think he maybe could be available even later, just looking at some of the data that I've seen. And the other is Jaheim Bell from Florida State, who was at the Senior Bowl, who transferred to Florida State this past season from South Carolina and is well regarded, who could play as like an H-back type and then also could go and run vertically. So those are two guys that I've seen that are on the tight end side of things that that Washington could target in that third round area.
Go ahead,
I
get
like
up.
hearing Sanders' name. No, I just love hearing Sanders' name. If you're talking about one guy who's got that, I'm in his corner. It's a name that at least, that's the thing. It's like you get excited about some of these guys before the draft itself, right? And then the hype gets you to a point where you're like, all right, well, that's out of the cards now. So to hear, there's almost like, not too bad the Sanders' name is kind of flailing right now because it might fall exactly where it is I need him. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, the reason why I think he could fall a little bit is because of a cognitive bias that we have as humans called anchoring bias. Yeah, you see it a lot in my data where because Jatavian Sanders was really well regarded as a prospect coming into the season, people kind of over-index on that as a prior belief. And so they just don't come off it as much as they really should, or they don't have the information or the the kind of permission from the like opinion elites to be like, oh, I can, rank Sanders lower. But I have a sense that I think he might be available after the third round too. And people will think of it as a steal, but we know more often than not the NFL does a very good job at evaluating players. And so the thing about the tight end position is that it really relies on the elite level to be athletic. And so, if you look at guys like Jordan Reed or, last year's draft, you saw like the most athletic of the players was a guy like Sam Laporta. This year it's Brock Bowers, but then, there's really a kind of a dearth of really not a lot of guys at the tight end position. Like I think that there'll be one tight end potentially on day one, and then I think there'll probably be maybe one or two on day two. I think more likely than not, you're going to see a guy like Ben Sinnott from Kansas State be a guy that goes in potentially in the second, or I think he'll be available in the second round, but not in the third. So if the Commanders want to go tight end in the second round, Ben Sinnott from Kansas State is an option, just because I think he hits more of those athletic benchmarks. But to me, the real offensive targets in this draft, quarterback, and then I think wide receiver. If you decide to go there, there's a lot of good options there at the beginning of that second round. But my sense is the Lions will be an area of focus along with quarterback.
Okay. One thing I wanted to pull a string on, if you will, which was what you had said, that if we were to get Jatavian Sanders, let's say at pick 78 overall, purely as an example, you had mentioned that maybe it would be viewed as a steal, but the NFL often is correct in its evaluations, if you will. Does that mean that there is no concept of a steal in the draft to you? Or I just wanted to make sure I understood that correctly, or somebody that's being overvalued in a reach?
No. So there's never, we don't, in terms of like analytics, we don't like to deal in absolutes. It's just about probabilities. And so and it's both sides of the coin. So we just know from research that's been done, a lot of it kind of by PFF, kind of confirming some of these kind of draft truisms that people in the analytics community have come to kind of to learn through years of studying the draft, is that on average, players that are drafted later than their position on the consensus big board, tend to perform closer to where they were drafted than they do to where they were on the big board. And sometimes that's because public lacks certain information, whether it be about medicals, but there are always exceptions. Like there are players that will get drafted later than where they were expected to go, or on their position on the big board, and will succeed. But just on average, more often than not, you're not going to get as much value as you would think from a player like that. And so on the other side of the coin, we also have a kind of another phenomenon, which is the idea of reaches. And we do have enough data to really know that reaches do tend to be reaches. Players on average, more often than not, tend to perform closer to where they were expected to go, or where they were on the consensus big board. And so to me, like that's something where you want to pay attention. And so, when the Commanders drafted a guy like Brian Robinson or Antonio Gibson, not only am I not a fan of that because of the devaluation of the running back position across the league, but those guys were drafted a bit earlier than where I thought they would go, and that's usually just not good process to consistently draft guys earlier than expected, just because they're more often than not going to perform where we thought they would.
Well,
So
you can
it's
even
not
use
it's not an ironclad rule, but
Ben.
it's
You
just
can even use the
probabilities,
initial
yeah.
example of Jamin Davis, who was a reach at the time, and it has taken him some time. He's had his moments certainly where he's been very good, but that was also considered a bit of a reach. Even last season, I know Emmanuel Forbes was close, but it did feel like a bit of a reach, especially with Christian Gonzalez on the board. So I think there's a lot of stuff that lends itself exactly to what you're saying. So if I could sum that up, it is that reaches are very much a thing, but steals not necessarily. It seems
Yeah.
to map much more with where they end up getting drafted, even though they were higher on big boards. And in cases of reaches, they actually do line up more with where they were on the big board instead of where they were actually drafted, just to sum that part up.
Is it just following up for a sec? Are there any, so understand, just kind of using the terminology we typically use as far as like that reach or steal aspect, are there some teams that you can see like historically might deviate a bit more from the consensus big board, but actually strike gold more than they strike out? Are there any organizations that sort of just seem as though they're just standing a little outside of what it is the consensus typically is?
Yeah, so you do see that occasionally. The 49ers, I think you see that quite a bit. They're kind of an outlier when it comes to that, but I think some of that is because I think the 49ers do use data. I think they just don't necessarily care where people are drafted, but at the same time, they also make huge bets on, for example, like second or third round running backs. And some of those guys don't even see the field very much. And last year they took a specialist in the third round. So, but on average, when you look at some of those teams at the very bottom, more often than not, you see teams that don't succeed in the draft or have developed the processes that lead them to draft players in a position where they're going to be drafting them usually earlier than where they go. And so you see a lot of those teams with turnover in their front office, like the Chargers, similar to the 49ers, the Rams, they kind of also view football, I think, in a smart, different way. But then you also see teams like the Patriots and the Falcons and the Saints, where they struggle a lot because they either don't necessarily care about value in the draft, or they just see football a certain way, and they don't necessarily think about, or don't have a process where they think where we want to take the consensus into account when we evaluate players. Teams like Seattle that have, had some success, but it doesn't really take a lot. Maybe it only takes like a couple of classes to strike out, and then you run into a player pipeline problem where you look at your roster and you see all these holes. And then you're kind of trying to fill in your Swiss cheese, roster, and it falls apart.
I feel like for whatever reason in my head, I have the Raiders as a team that consistently reach, where they just, whether it be the first or second round, I'm like, I didn't even know that player was considered a first round pick, and all of a sudden there they are.
Yeah. So I was pretty bullish about the Raiders general manager, who was fired alongside with Josh McDaniels this year. I'm like forgetting his name, David something like that, I forget. But who came from the Patriots with him.
Yeah.
I liked some of what they did last year. They had, I thought, a pretty strong class. They had Tyree Wilson, they had Michael Mayer. Like it was more value-based drafting. And then this year they bring in Tom Telesco, who, to me was not the most value-based drafter in the world, and does not have a lot of demonstrated success in the draft over the last 4 or 5 years.
You just mentioned the Chargers, just for those that don't know,
Yeah.
from the Chargers to the Raiders. Basically.
Yeah, and so to me that was a little strange to go from like, oh, we're gonna go for like this Patriots combo, who I think the Patriots, the personnel folks who have left the Patriots have been very successful in recent years. Outside of the Detroit group, have been pretty good. Whether it's like Nick Caserio, Monty Ossenfort, and then this guy who was with Las Vegas. I thought they all were doing pretty solid jobs in the GM role. But yeah, to me the Raiders, they had a time when Mike Mayock and John Gruden were at the helm, where they made lots of really questionable decisions, not just on eval, but on player. So yeah, Clelin Ferrell at pick 5 when he thought he was gonna go in the 20s. You got Josh Jacobs in the first round. They had a Henry Ruggs at wide receiver 1 when everyone thought it would be Jerry Jeudy, but it would be okay if you went CeeDee Lamb. let alone Justin Jefferson, who we'll forget about.
We would have appreciated them taking CeeDee Lamb, just to be clear. That would have been nice. They had done that.
But yeah, so yeah, the Raiders did a lot of like very heterodox things, but to me, it can work in your favor if you have a plan or like an organizational strategy around, what makes those players different. If you're just drafting players because, for example, Josh Allen from, of the Jaguars from Kentucky, was the favorite to be one of the top edge rushers in that class. And, in that 2019 class, right? And instead they went with Farrell because quote unquote, he was a 4-3 defensive end. But instead, you shouldn't draft players to match your scheme. You should make your scheme based off of the players you have. And so, if you just say, I'm going to take the guy who plays that kind of position, regardless of talent, then you're going to end up with a situation where, is Farrell with Washington this year? He's definitely not in Las Vegas. I think he was with the 49ers last year. I don't forget where he is.
I think it was 1 year 5. I'll double check.
Yeah. I was going on 4 years straight. Well, during the entire Gruden Mayock era, I nailed every first round Raiders pick just by looking at the name and the photo of who was available.
Alex Leatherwood.
When you saw Leatherwood, it was like, there's no way he's not going to be.
He's got to be a Raider.
He's got to be a
Raider.
Great stuff.
That's smart. I got to ask you who they're going to take next year.
Oh yeah, you definitely should have KDOT on for Raiders picks moving forward. Another question. So you had actually mentioned value scheme, things like that. Do you see in the data, now that you've been doing this long enough, like, do you see teams drafting more for need versus best player available? We keep hearing that, right? That debate between need and best player available. Based on what you see, do you see teams veering a certain way? Is it a mix? What were your thoughts there?
I think it's always a mix. I think it's tough to say whether a pick is a need pick or whether a team is a
well. As taking a quarterback,
pick.
I think it's quite clear.
That can be a need. I wouldn't necessarily know how to like calculate whether a pick based off of like some data was like a need pick
Fair
or
enough.
a best player available pick, because it could be both. A lot of people think that, for example, like Caleb Williams is the top player in the draft. Some people think Marvin Harrison is. If so, to me, like there's also positional value. There's also kind of, you could be thinking about need, but you could be thinking about need for a year ahead. But that also could be best player available. So to me, it's a little hard to say. I think a lot of teams have fairly similar grades on players in day 1 and then day 2. And then in day 3, it really tends to diverge a lot, mostly because teams don't evaluate don't have it on their board, right? Every single player in the draft. You want to make the decision space when you have to make a pick smaller, so you don't have to pick between 5 guys. Instead, you're picking between maybe 2 or 3 guys. I think the problem that some teams get is they get kind of too married to their board, and so in that case, if you end up being a team where you already know, hey, we're targeting this guy in this round, then that can be a situation where you end up taking a player based on need or based on grade instead of based on ability. So I remember talking, I work with teams, and I was talking with someone from a team, not a team that I work with. And I said, hey, I thought that this pick was a reach because I think a lot of people did. And they're like, well, he was the top player on our board. And, my answer to them is, just because he's a top player on your board doesn't mean you have to take him. But a lot of teams, to kind of make their decisions easier, will have targets in every single round kind of preordained in some ways before the draft. And when you do that, it can make your decision easier, but it also can lead you to making a decision just because you've made the decision base so small, when you should be like more open to the opportunity of another player, being just as good or being available or being someone that could be a fit for your team. So, but you see that more often on day 3, just because the boards are not, 250 players. Every team's board could be 100, maybe 150 players that they think would be for them, or that they've done background work on, or that they think their coaches like, for example.
Gotcha. Okay, Doc, go ahead.
Oh no, well, it was just natural curiosity to, I guess, a certain degree. Usually we see that there's a period of time, like right up before the draft, where you start hearing the hype about somebody, right? So I think this year is probably JJ McCarthy more than anybody. Where like national championship game's over, and now you got the run up to where the combine, and right before the draft, there's that lying season, right? Is there anybody to look out for, just as I'm watching the draft, that might take that slide? That like maybe there's a conversation brewing about a particular guy, but from what you're seeing or what it looks like as far as big boards or anything, this guy
Hmm.
might be sitting for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the quarterbacks specifically, I don't think McCarthy is someone who I think people are lying about. I think that he may not go in the top 5, but I think he's definitely going in the top 10. And so I think, that type of lying season could be, among us right now. But to me, Bo Nix and Michael Penix, I mentioned earlier that I think they're both going to be second rounders.
Yeah.
So to me, like those are the quarterbacks that I see people talking about a lot that I think we have to not, you can't. Yeah. I just don't. Yeah, they're both on the overage side of things. And this is one of the last big year of the players with COVID eligibility who played 5 years when they should have played 4. Bo Nix started 60 games in college, like 30 games at Auburn and like 30 games at Oregon. And Penix as well has played for a while at Indiana and at Washington. They have somewhat problematic statistical profiles as well, but the NFL wants to bet on quarterbacks who have upside, and so that means that they have athletic ability, they can throw the ball, they're young. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of why the league would like a player like JJ McCarthy. There's a lot of like tired narratives, just like on Penix as they are on McCarthy. You can tell that they really only watched like the playoffs, like, and didn't watch them at all the rest of the season. Like none of that stuff matters at all, or they only watch a few games. You really need to take and play the whole picture. You need to take the whole picture.
Don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So when you look at the entire picture, to me, the lying season is on. I expect 4 quarterbacks in the first round, which is already really high.
Good, yeah.
4 is usually a really healthy amount of quarterbacks. 5 is like a lot. It's really extra, and 6 is like insane.
Yeah.
So yeah, to me, that's where the lying is mostly happening. And then to me, the player that I don't think it's lying. I just think it's like a lack of creativity in the mock draft space is Dallas Turner from Alabama, who's an edge rusher who like something like I'd say 60% of his mocks are like him to Atlanta. And so I'd pick 8 or 9. And so to me, like there's a lot of like groupthink about the top 10. And so for me, like there's just people need to be more creative about some of the landing spots. I'm excited to see some of that change with like maybe someone like a Brock Bowers probably maybe falling outside of the top 10, maybe a player like Turner also falling a little bit outside the top 10, or maybe just inside the top 10. But the quarterbacks are really where we see, and they're the most over-mocked position in my data accounting for draft position. Every year you can go back and find a player that was mocked in the first round that ended up not going there. 2018, Mason Rudolph went to the Steelers in the 3rd round. 2019, Drew Lock went to Denver, and I think also in the 2nd or 3rd round. And you end up with, last year, like, Hendon Hooker and also Will Levis, Malik Willis the year before, Matt Corral, Sam Howell. Like I think the media just wants to be able to talk about quarterbacks, but I think the type is legit with McCarthy. I think it's real. I think he's a player that deserves to go, and I think has been ever since the end of the season. Once he kind of came in, then I think people needed to consider him in the top 10. I think top 5 is rich, but if it's not a bad thing, because trading up for a quarterback can have more upside than trading up for like Brock Bowers.
Okay. Now whatever. We were talking. Kate and I have talked about these guys a whole bunch. So there's that. We wanted to also talk about just how you're feeling on the Commanders as a whole, right? So. And we would ask about rounds 5 and 7, but there's so much variability at that stage in time. You just talked about it with round 4. So we're not going to do that. Okay. But do check out grindingthemocks.com. The Commanders, we're rebuilding, new ownership, new general manager, new coaching staff, pretty star-studded coaching staff, a lot of names that people know from around the league. Now we're winning the edges, by hiring people outside of the salary cap restrictions. When it comes to just doing business deals and stuff, we should talk about that on the next episode. Kate, pretty awesome. How do you feel about the Commanders moving forward? The over/under on their win total is 6.5. What are your thoughts on the Commanders this upcoming season from what you've seen so far?
I think the vibe is really good. I think whatever quarterback they take is going to come into a good situation. To me, the thing that makes their vibe, I think, really positive and their outlook really positive is, like I said, that the amount of draft capital they have to play with. And some of that was making tough decisions this past year, whether it's, trading Chase Young and Montez Sweat kind of at a loss, when I think a lot of teams, especially teams, the regime that drafted them, would want to extend that player, but realizing that, the optionality there and, moving on, it's easier to move on from players that you didn't select, but still, it still takes a lot of, I give a lot of kudos to the new staff, but I think they have a green field. The vibes are good. The ownership is good. And so for me, I'm bullish on them. I think it doesn't matter really, I think, who they select. I would say that I'm expecting them to take Drake Maye. I think that with him, I think both any quarterback there is going to struggle this year just because it's going to be a lot of newness in the league. But I expect the Commanders to hit a little over their win total. I think the Giants are a team in decline. I think the Cowboys could regress a little bit too. And I think that, I think the Eagles are not necessarily as strong as we thought they were. We'll see what happens. I think that they could win like 7 games potentially, or maybe even 8. I don't think that they get over 500, but I think that I wouldn't be surprised if they hit over their win total. But I think the odds were pretty even there, when like kind of juiced either way too much. But I like whoever they have to have some success. I don't really love the backup quarterback. I don't love it. So to me,
Murata?
Yeah, I
Sorry,
don't
it's
love
an inside
Mariota.
joke.
Okay, gotcha. I was like, am I having a stroke? But yeah, I don't love
Someone
the
was.
I don't love the backup quarterback. And so to me, that's something where, like, I'm not saying that they should have paid out the wazoo for like a Gardner Minshew or whoever, but you'd like to have someone better than Mariota. And so that's why I kind of think that they could go after a second quarterback later in the draft, just to have behind who could take snaps if something happens with, with Jayden Daniels or Drake Maye or JJ McCarthy or whoever. But yeah, to me, the vibes in DC are good. I think people will want to go to games. And I expect them to have a better year this year than they did last year, for sure, at the very least.
Sounds great to me. So to quickly recap that, 7 to 8 wins we're looking at, but below 500. So we're looking at between around 6 to 9 wins over there, 7 and 8 more specifically. You believe they'll take Drake Maye, and you do think that there is a shot that we use maybe that 7th round pick or maybe a 5th rounder, or, a lot of trades happen at that point in the draft as well. And we get another QB to also fill up the room. Of course, we got Marcus Mariota and Jake Fromm. So those are the 2 right now. Maybe we want somebody besides pick 2 overall. We shall see. K-Dot, any final questions here?
How much money you clearing on FanDuel every year? Because it sounds like you should be making a killing.
So I don't bet on the draft, just because I work with teams and it's unethical to do both of those at the same time.
Oh, you got a good heart too. I love you, man.
I'm not.
Shout out John Tate Porter.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not the sharp football analysis guy. Well, whatever, Walter Sharp or whatever. What's his name? I forget. But yeah, I'm not that guy. Not that guy.
I'm calling Walter Sharp moving forward. I like it.
What's his name? Yeah.
Oh man. Anyway, Ben, thank you very much for coming on. Why don't you take a minute, tell us how we can find you, where all we can find you, and then again, a bit more about grindingthemocks.com before we wrap up here.
Yeah, sure. So grindingthemocks.com is where you can find the site. It has our top 50 that, has updated now in this month every week, but starting on Monday, we'll be updating every morning with the new numbers on where the class is based on the most recent, latest and greatest mock draft data. So you can find me there. You can find me on the socials at Grinding Mocks on Twitter, at BENJ_Robinson as well, if you want to follow my personal takes, like how Liverpool's doing not so awesome. But yeah, you can find me there. I should have a mock draft and a top 100 list at the Unexpected Points Substack, which is run by my friend and DC resident, or I guess, not DC, in Montgomery County, Kevin Cole. But yeah, for the most part, yeah, I'm not at Football Outsiders anymore because rest in peace, Football Outsiders. But yeah, I'm still writing about the draft, still posting a lot of different charts and insights on my socials. But yeah, I'm excited for the draft next week. Excited to see some cool local DMV players go. There's probably like maybe 5 or 6 guys that I think could could go in the top 100 who have DMV ties. And so I'm excited to see those guys have success on draft night and success in the league.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that as well. And just real quick, that was what, Caleb Williams, Olu Fashanu, who were the couple of the others? Chop Robinson.
Yeah, Chop Robinson, who I learned Chop is a nickname. Chop is like short for pork chop. Apparently that's like something like a nickname that he was called ever since he was a kid. I can understand why he would want to be called Chop and not pork chop. I've much more fear Chop than I do pork chop. And then a couple other guys, Christian Haynes from Connecticut, who's a guard who's from Bowie, Maryland, and then Kyrie Jackson, cornerback from Oregon, who's from Upper Marlboro, Maryland. So a lot of Maryland guys, not a lot of Virginia guys. I'm not sure what that says about anything, but not a lot of Virginia guys this year.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and explore that while you focus on the mock draft. So we thoroughly appreciate it. This was District Divided, a DC sports podcast, more specifically a Washington Commanders podcast. I am Amit. That is K-Dot. That is Ben Robinson. Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, comment as you always do, and K-Dot.
Make sure Ground the Mox is in your favorites or whatever internet browser you prefer. And then share this shit.
And then share this shit. Now you're going to see the top 50 on Grinding the Mox. If you want to see 51 through whatever, start working for a team and start lobbying to get this guy on board, because then you can see all of it at that point. That's where all the really, really good stuff is, but we still get some pretty fucking great stuff in the top 50
The
there.
countdown's already started. The Commander's going to be offering this man a contract pretty soon. I mean,
Very much looking forward to it. And then
they know where to find me. They know where to find me.
Well, once again, we appreciate you guys. We will catch you with a special Monday episode that's going to be our mock drafts. Now we have this information. We're going to continue to follow the news. We will give you our mock drafts on Monday. So until then, enjoy the weekend. Take it easy.
Bye, everybody.
In DC, we're just hoping that you listen.